All right, thank you all for coming out tonight. You may think this is miserable weather, but I came from Central Virginia, where we measured 24 inches of snow last weekend. I called home today. There's still an inch plus on the ground, so I'm relatively happy to be here. All right. So what I want to talk about is income inequality. It's a topic that many people have become interested in over the last, say, 5 years or so, and especially after the financial crisis in 2008. With the election of President Obama, there were protests. We'll look at some of these things about the rise of the 1%, and potential problems that arise as income inequality gets higher and higher. So the title is Beyond Piketty, the Pope, and the President, and these are three well-known people who've really highlighted the income inequality question. Right, so that's Thomas Piketty. He wrote this about 700-page book called Capital in the 21st Century. It's terribly boring and dry if you try to read it, yet it was the #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for a few weeks a couple years ago, suggesting that people do have a real interest in understanding what's going on in terms of the incomes of at least the top 10% or so. And his basic story, if you go and read the book, is he claims he's discovered some sort of fundamental law of capitalism, which can be summarized in R greater than G. And to oversimplify maybe a little bit, what Piketty argues is R is more or less the income, the rate of return on the income of the rich. G, one way to think about it, is the growth rate of the income of the average American, say. Well, if the income of the top is growing faster than the income in the median or the mean, well, you're going to get rising inequality. And he documents this with some tax record data in the United States, plus they're up to, I think, almost 20 countries now, looking at this type of story. Right here, this is Pope Francis in the Apostolic Exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel. There was a quote that caught a lot of attention a couple years ago, and I highlighted the key phrase there: "It's such an economy kills." Well, this economy he's referring to is an economy of exclusion and inequality. And as you can see up there, if you read the quote, he draws attention to, if a homeless person, say, dies in the United States tonight, that will not make the evening news. Yet any change in the Dow Jones Industrial Average will. I think yesterday it only moved like 5 points, and yet that was still newsworthy. He thinks something is wrong with that we place so much attention on wealth creation or destruction in the financial markets, and we're ignoring real people. On December 3rd, 2013, President Obama gave a speech where he claims that the defining challenge of our time is income inequality and income mobility. And we'll talk about both of those, or I'll talk about both of those tonight. So a lot of people are talking about this topic. I've had a long-standing interest in it. When I did my dissertation, half of it was on world income distribution. That was about 10 years ago. And I have the referee reports to prove to you, if you want to see them, that nobody cared 10 years ago about this topic. Yeah, this is an interesting paper, but no one cares. Right? Inequality is not an issue. And we'll talk about why economists think that way. You get more sympathy in, say, sociology or political science than you do in economics, but that's a real issue. Also, from not that long ago now, this is Occupy Wall Street. It was never going to work. There was really no plan. What they were complaining about was really undefined, but there were signs like this that we are the 99%. Okay, I mean, that's, if anyone looked at the numbers, being in the top 1% in the United States is not a terribly high number. It's about $192,000 a year. It's a lot of money, but it's not as high. It's not millionaires who are the 1%. Okay, that's really the 0.1% or the 0.01%. That's who we're talking about. But if you just look at the data that comes from the IRS or the census, it's not that terribly high. But lots of people think, well, income share of the 1% in the United States has skyrocketed. Right? You can see it there. That's from Piketty's database. Many of you have probably seen it. It peaks about 1929. It comes down during the Great Depression and the Second World War. It still declines a little bit after the war till about 1970-ish, depending on how you measure it. 71, 72. Income share for the top 1% begins to increase. And then you'll notice there's a sharp spike in there right around 1986. Well, that you got to take note of, because that's probably an artifact of the 1986 Tax Reform Act, where what happened there was marginal income tax rates were brought down below corporate income tax rates. So lots of people could classify themselves as corporations, and they claimed the corporate income, now claim themselves as individuals, because that's what happened with the tax code. That explains at least part of what the enormous shift you see there around 1987, 88 in the data. That's not to say that inequality hasn't been rising, at least if this is how you measure it. But you want to be careful when you look at this data, because it's sometimes not obvious what's happening. So you might look at this data. This is another country for about 100, that's up until about 1985 from 1910. A relatively steady decline in the income share of the top 1%. There's a spike there during the Second World War, because this is a mineral-based economy. And if you think the 1% is a good measure, you might want to be like this country. Except, this is that country. That is the top 1% income share data for South Africa. So you'd be saying, hey, apartheid was great. Look what it did. It brought down the share of the top 1%. Right? In South Africa, it gets better. Because look what's happened since the end of apartheid. Income inequality has gotten worse. And that is true for South Africa. Since 1994, the end of apartheid, income inequality has worsened in there. And that, I think, is a real issue in social science to try to understand what's going on. But my broader point is, if you're going to talk about income inequality in the United States, you shouldn't just pick one variable that you happen to think is correct. That we're going to look at 4 other ones later on just to see what generally is happening, to get a better sense in this of what's happening. Because remember, the 1% is only the 1%. That means we're not really commenting on what's going on with the other 99% of the distribution. In other words, the vast majority of Americans. If you read Piketty's stuff closely, he almost always has a little qualifying remark that goes, this isn't really about inequality, this is this income share. We can't say what's happening in the rest of the distribution because we do not have the data for it, at least if you're measuring it this way. So that's just some caution that we should keep in mind when you look at this data. So why do economists have problems with this? When I talk to a lot of people about inequality, I get responses like this. So that's Bob Lucas. He won the Nobel Prize in 1995 in economics. And he thinks this is a terrible idea. Right? The most poisonous, is my emphasis. Why are we talking about income inequality when they're like right now, this very moment, there's a baby being born in India that is not going to have much opportunity, may not even survive to the weekend. Shouldn't we focus our attention on that question? In other words, global poverty, extreme poverty, not American poverty now. Real poverty, people living on like $1 a day or $2 a day. So for a lot of economists, that's the response that you would get. We want to talk about poverty, not inequality. Inequality is a distraction. Or as Martin Feldstein of Harvard wrote, right, when we focus on inequality, we're really being spiteful egalitarians. For some reason, even though your income has gone up, you're angry because someone else's has gone up more. Right? This is envy, this is resentment, this is bad for social cohesion. So a lot of economists will say the same thing. Oh, Bob, you're talking about inequality. Why are you stoking the flames of envy in the United States? But my position, and what I'm going to try to make the case tonight, is from last year's Nobel laureate, Angus Deaton, which is a nice pithy way to summarize my view on this, really, is I both love inequality and I'm terrified of it. I love it in the sense that if people work hard, if you think back, if you read the Obama quote earlier, they can succeed. Part of understanding income inequality is understanding, well, there's probably good reasons, say, psych majors and comm majors make less than computer science majors. It's not randomness that's going on. Right? Just think about the investments necessary to get a computer science degree relative to, say, communications or psychology. Plus, if you add, just look at the sheer numbers of psychology and communications majors relative to computer scientists. You've seen enormous increases in communications majors, for example, over the past few decades. Computer science majors, in absolute terms, have relatively been flat since about the mid-1980s across the country. Right? So that kind of inequality doesn't really bother me. I don't think it bothers you. Where you get terrified of it is, what if that's not what's going on? What if rather the game itself, meaning the market, is being rigged in favor of some groups over others? Are there some groups that are being excluded from these potential gains? Are there restrictions in their way that prevent people from getting jobs or expanding existing businesses or getting certain types of education? Right? That's when you can be concerned. And what I want to talk about tonight is I remain relatively agnostic on the question, is it going up a good or bad thing? I want to know why it has gone up in the United States, depending on how you measure it, since the late 60s and early 70s. That's really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in philosophical debates about inequality and stuff like that. I'm not remotely qualified for that. But rather I want to understand what are the processes that are generating the distribution. To get to that, we first have to be clear what we are talking about. When you hear income inequality, it's not really obvious what they're measuring or even what they're talking about. So for example, are we talking about your income before you pay taxes or after you pay taxes? Because those are two different stories that are actually going on. In other words, are we including all the transfers that take place, the redistribution, and is that your real income? Or are we talking about the pre-market income? For me, tonight, I'm interested in pre-market income, because I want to see how legal institutions are affecting it. But depending on who you talk to, right, they may be talking about something else. Obviously, post-tax income inequality is a lot less than pre-tax, right, because the redistribution has taken place. So you need to be careful about that. You also have to always check what's the unit they're talking about, because there's different ways to measure this. Right? Are we talking about a household? Or are we talking, which could have, say 2 income earners in it, versus individuals, which is just one. Right? The different measures measure it different ways, so you have to make sure you look into what they're actually talking about. Also, this is a project that's ongoing right now. I'm working with a student measuring leisure inequality in the United States. It has gone way up since the 1960s. Americans are working less hours per week than they used to. And the fun part about that distribution is more or less the bottom 50%, that's where all the gains in leisure have been. The top 10%, I think, maybe top 20, is actually working more hours now than in 1965. Where the rest of the distribution, and all parts of the distribution, on the bottom, 2/3 or 3/4 or so, 4/5 have experienced increases in leisure. And if you think leisure has any positive value, then if we're talking about what's going on, we need to include this. This is a lot of discussion right now about income inequality in the United States highlights this fact that the world is segregating into 2 groups. Those who go online and raise their productivity. They know what they're doing. The other group uses the internet to watch cat videos. No, I'm sure it's fun if you like cats. But there's lots of things that can waste your time. Right? It's not raising your productivity. And we're getting more and more evidence that there's sort of this polarization taking place in the United States to help drive part of the story. Another thing that's happened since the early 1980s in the United States that people don't talk about that much. And this is the market for marriage. Right? I'm an economist, that's how you think about marriage. What's happened is you tend to marry someone similar to you. Right? That intuitively makes sense. One margin where you tend to marry is on educational attainment. People who have college degrees tend to marry people who have college degrees. People who only have high school degrees tend to only marry people who have high school degrees. Right? That's what's happened since 1980. Before that, you often had usually a man who had a college degree would marry a woman who didn't have a college degree. Right? This is still dates back to things back in the 60s. The big changes in the 60s. But that takes time to work through the system. So by the early 80s, you're seeing this sorting. You see PhDs marry PhDs. People with master's degrees marry people with master's degrees. Well, this is going to exert upward pressure, so to speak, on the income distribution if you're measuring households. Right? The equalizing effect of someone with a college degree marrying someone without is gone. So you get some separation on this. There's been some pretty good work in sociology looking at exactly the extent of this. Also, this sounds mundane, but you'll be surprised how many people make this mistake. When you look at the Gini coefficient, you should laugh at it in the one that's most commonly presented. It is glaringly wrong. And what happened was, in 1992, they changed the definitions. So if you look at the data, here it is. I asked my principal students there, don't you think something strange in that picture? If you believe that picture, if you take it literally, The single biggest increase in income inequality in the United States in the post-war period is the first year of the Clinton presidency. And those of you who remember that year, it wasn't that great. It wasn't bad. The economy was expanding, but it wasn't like growing like gangbusters. And all this is because of a change in methodology. Simple as that. The BLS has begged people for years, has special reports. Please do not compare the two series without making some kind of adjustments. And I've looked at a number of prestigious journals, from publications in the last 5 years, and hardly anyone makes the change. They just download and run regressions, right? No, you need to make sure you really understand what is generating this data before you start telling your stories. Now, what people often say to me, say, "Oh, Bob, that's all interesting and great." But really, remember what Lucas said and some others have said, President Obama said, we should be talking about mobility. What are the chances of people born in the bottom, say, quintile or decile, and to move up to the top, or at least in the top half? That's a fair point. One thing that keep in mind is we know hardly anything about income mobility in the United States. We actually haven't tracked people over time. You got to track your parents. Let's see what their income was at, say, 25, 30, 35, 40. And then map yours in underneath it and see is yours higher or lower. There's basically only been one study that's tried to do it. And what it found is no change since the 1970s. Right? The base year is like 1972 or something like that. But more or less no change until the present. So we're not really sure. You got to be cautious with that. A more speculative concern that I have when we look at mobility numbers, when we go, okay, so what quintile were you born in? Did you spend 1 year, and that's often how it's asked, in some quintile higher than yours? And a large number of people in the United States say yes. I did. I even made it up to the top quintile. Well, okay, it's actually not that hard if there's inheritance. I think right now the average inheritance in the United States is $177,000. Right, that's not equal across all groups. Roughly, if you get an inheritance valued at $30,000, pretty much anywhere you are in the distribution, you will move up to the next quintile or quartile. Right, if you look at the data, the gaps are roughly high 20s in the gaps. It struck me actually thinking about this because my own father was like this. It turns out he got an inheritance from an uncle in the 6 digits, and I started thinking, wow, he finally made it to the top. But it's just 1 year. And if you think about the questions or data you might see, that's what they'll say, is did you make it to that quintile for 1 year? Because then when you look at the 2-year numbers, it decays fast. You didn't get there and sustained yourself. So I'm working with another student, we're creating an artificial economy, and we're playing around with inheritance data that was collected in the United States by the Federal Reserve since the 60s. And we can break it down by deciles and see how much we can generate through randomness, just through your parents having to accumulate things and leaving you a house that you end up selling, versus how much of it is really you've worked hard and you moved up through your own efforts. A question that's often not asked when you say, okay, did you move up? The follow-up question is, well, what did you do? There's lots of ways to get more money, some more honest than others. Right, so that's another question to think about. How did you get the monies? What we call rent-seeking in economics. Did you basically lobby successfully to game the system in your favor to maintain high levels of income? Right? That's what I'm going to begin to focus in on. There's some other possibilities, though. First, this is the Great Gatsby's curve. Alan Kruger was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors a few years ago. He made this popular. Basically, what this thing is saying is the little dots, they call them commuting areas. You can think of those as metropolitan areas. So those are 20 metropolitan areas in the United States. On the x-axis is a Gini coefficient for income. On the y-axis is more or less how many people who started off in the bottom quartile moved up to some other quartile. And the claim there, it's just correlations of course, is that there's less inequality, higher mobility. And then the intuition behind that is if inequality is getting higher, think of the income distribution as a ladder. Inequality is increasing, the gaps between the rungs are getting farther apart, and as a result, it's harder and harder to move up. Right, so this is a popular idea that Kruger and others have been highlighting. Of course, you can always say, but poverty, right? That's what we should be talking about. That's explicitly what Lucas was about. And you might say, okay, when we talk about inequality, maybe it's consumption inequality that really matters. And by that, I mean, my iPhone and LeBron James' iPhone are not terribly different, even though our incomes wildly are. Okay? For a lot of consumption goods, what you can consume and the richest people in the country consume is basically the same thing. It's not true for all goods, but for lots of goods. And although it seems that this was true for a lot of the post-war period, if you measure just consumption bundles of the rich and the middle class and say the poor, there seems to be some sort of convergence going on. In other words, there's a decrease in consumption inequality. Since the 80s, maybe 90s now, it looks like it's rising again. Another thing that always strikes me as odd, borderline like pathological, is when people go, I only care about the bottom 10%. It seems weird that you're indifferent over 90% of the distribution. I don't really what cares what happens to those people. Right? I really just care about the bottom 10%. That's often something you'll hear about poverty, which I think sort of strains credibility when you say that. Also, yeah, like I said, Derek mentioned it, I'm an economist, so I think about utility functions. When we put someone else's income in a utility function, what is it there for? Is it envy, like Martin Feldstein said? Is it altruism because you actually care about the other people? Right? Or is it, say a notion of social justice? There's something that you just think is fundamentally wrong about rising inequality. It itself is a value. So that's something that you want to think about when you talk about maybe I think intuitively anyway, most of us do care about the relative incomes of people. Maybe I don't really care about Bill Gates' income. That's too much for my little brain to handle. But maybe my neighbors, my colleagues, things like that. And sometimes you do compare yourself against others. Your classmates, when you go out and play life, and you'll see some of your classmates will do better than you. Some will do worse. And are you concerned for the right reasons or the wrong reasons? Similarly, Branko Milanovic, who was at the World Bank for quite a while, says, part of this makes the claim anyway, that when we talk about poverty rather than inequality, what we're trying to do is deflect attention away from the historical roots of inequality, say in the United States. Legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, that kind of thing, is another possibility. Because as you can point out, really the only people I've ever heard say this are affluent and almost always white. And that's the only people who've ever made this argument to me. Is it a way to deflect attention away from the deeper roots of the issue? So why might inequality matter? I already mentioned the proxy for social justice. This is the big story here in the United States, that the rich are buying the political system, they're using the political system to alter the rules of the game or the legal system in their favor. And they're squashing out entrepreneurship and innovation from the bottom, say 50% or more of the distribution. It's a story of crony capitalism. You hear this go back to the Occupy Wall Street crowd. They were upset about the banks, the too big to fail institutions. And you'll hear stories and complaints about no one went to jail for what happened in 2008. Someone had been held accountable. Or if you look at the data now, those too big to fail institutions in 2008 are even bigger now than they were then. You've seen an enormous slowdown in the finance sector. The number of new banks that are being started in the U.S. is really, really low if you look at the data. I think in like 11 or 10, there were like 0 new banks in the United States. Right? It's getting harder for new banks to start up. Meanwhile, the top is getting bigger and bigger. This is what concerns people. Then you tie it into the so-called revolving door between Wall Street and the Treasury, and you have people really concerned about what's happening in the United States. But also something that happened about this was tied into finance as well is, I don't think you guys have this major, financial engineering. Okay, that was like the biggest major in the Ivy League schools leading up to the financial crisis. Right? Those are weapons of mass destruction. I don't want to get off too far down the path of what was going on in the financial sector and all the derivatives and stuff that were created leading up to the financial crisis. But these were people who were creating financial instruments that many have claimed are just purely redistribution. They are not raising productivity. High-frequency trading on Wall Street, when the amount of time that you have to profit on new information is down to like the milliseconds if you plan on going to Wall Street. Right? Where the proximity to the physical building, where the stock exchange is, matters because you need that millisecond advantage in order to make money. Right? Is this just pure redistributional, or is this raising efficiency and productivity? Right? People are concerned about this. In other words, there's a massive diversion of talented young people away from certain sectors towards games that are about redistribution. That's one thing that people are really concerned about. Also, as inequality gets wider and wider, it makes it harder for people to empathize. Right? As social distance grows, and there's lots of evidence on this, you are less likely to be willing to help out people. It's your friends, it was always bad luck, right? So you help them out. When it's some random stranger, well, they must have some sort of behavior that was, led to this, or a series of bad decisions. It's easy to rationalize when you don't really know what's going on at the other end of the story. Right? So that's another thing, and we do have data suggesting there's just less charitable giving as a result of this. And also, right, rising inequality has been associated with vandalism, things like that, theft, crime. Well, if I'm rich and I want to protect my stuff, I can, hire a private, move into a gated community, for example. Right? I can devote resources to making sure my house is protected. Well, keep in mind, those resources could have been deployed somewhere else in the event that this wasn't an issue. You could have been using it for investment to raise productivity and help out other people. Instead, you're using it just to protect your resources. So this is a number of reasons why people are concerned. And also, in case you're not sure, if you're unsure who our fearless leader is, he was writing about this back in 1776. Right? This is like about status. Right? Yes, thinking about this is a shoes example. No matter how poor you were back in London, right, you didn't go out there barefoot. You were going to debt. Because you needed to show a certain level of status compared to others. You didn't want to reveal you were poor. What this means is that also means you're not savings. There's no savings in this world. Instead, you're like outside, everything seems fine. Or I've heard stories about old houses from like 100 years ago. You go on the first floor of the house, it's like immaculate. Right? It's a beautiful house, so your friends would see it. And then you go upstairs and you're like sleeping on straw. Okay? Right? You didn't have stuff upstairs. The image, the projection, was leading you to not have savings. Right? And this is, some people have argued, results because of increasing inequality. Now, some of the popular explanations before we get to mine. Right, we mentioned this. And these are quotes just from a Pew survey when they ask people, well, what do you think's going on? From a few years ago now. Right, the wealthy have political clout, and they're able to exploit the tax system. Right, if you've ever looked at the tax code, you probably have a lot of sympathy with that position. It's how many thousands of pages is that thing? Right, so it's really designed, it seems to have evolved in favor of the rich. Right, immigration, of course, is an issue people bring up today. Immigration, they're here. You increase in the number of immigrants, it drives down wages, increasing inequality. Right, this is in the bottom end, the low-skilled sector of the economy. Right, the internet I mentioned. Some people know how to use it. Some people don't know how to use it. Right, maybe that's the problem. I don't know what the policy implication is. Get rid of the internet. I don't know. Even the North Koreans can't do that. Right, greedy people, my all-time favorite one. Especially in this day and age of oil barrel prices at below, what, like $30 or something? This wave of altruism has taken over the oil companies, right? They're so happy with the cheap oil prices and gas prices. Right? But it's greed is driving it. Or if you've ever talked to anyone who's really worked on Wall Street, they know of no period where they just all weren't greedy. Right? That seems to be a constant. It's like water runs downhill. Right? That's not much of an explanation for what's going on, but people think it. Right? Globalization. This was a popular story within economics for a long time. I think it's starting to erode a little bit now. Basically, just what happened is sometime in the 70s, maybe early 80s, there was increased, through globalization, increased demand for high-skilled workers. Right? Meaning people who went and got college degrees. And that, in order to stay competitive internationally, U.S. firms did this, and this is what's driving it. So a lot of the gains, it's college educated. Right? That's really what this is about. Right? Or just my sort of favorite one, it takes money to make money. So the rich somehow, and this is kind of Piketty's story, to be honest. When you think about it, if you work through, the rich just get this income, this interest income that grows forever. How it grows, no one really knows. He never specifies. It just grows because it grows. Which goes back to some older economics. But that's, another explanation people have out there. All right, so the economic explanations. We've mentioned the first one. Right? It's about human capital. It's just what you decide your major is. You can go out there after this talk tonight and look at what your expected income is, depending on your major. And it will vary a lot. Right? That's what economists will tend to focus in on, the investments in human capital, which I already mentioned ties into the globalization story. The increased demand, whatever reason that was, we don't really know. There's increased demand for high-skilled workers, and that's what's driving a lot of the story. Another popular story is the decline of unions, private sector unions. That's when it's out there, right? As workers weren't as able to negotiate as effectively as they were when they negotiated collectively. This has led to some kind of bidding down of wages over time, exacerbating inequality. Right. Also, another claim is, I think 1968-69, somewhere around then, is the real value of the minimum wage is maximized. And since then, it has steadily declined. This is what motivates a lot of the discussion now in the United States for a $15 minimum wage, $15 an hour. Right, it's eroded over time. And as a result, those at the bottom aren't making as much. Income has grown much faster at the top. Income inequality rises. But another popular story of changes in marginal tax rates. You go back like in the 50s or so, I think the highest marginal tax rate was 94%. It steadily came down to 28 by the 1980s. It's gone up a little bit since then. Right, corporate taxes have also come down. And when you look at generally the tax has been really cut in percentage terms from the top, not so much from the bottom. Right, so this in turn has led to the rise in income of, say, the 1%. Other possibilities are deregulation. Sometimes it's interesting when people just pick 1980 as their starting point for the rise in inequality. It really tips their hand and their political views, because you really should look at the beginning of the rise of inequality. It's like 1972, not 1980. But the claim is there's some sort of deregulation that takes place in the United States. Yes, they deregulated some trucking. Airlines got deregulated. Good luck finding much financial market deregulation. Probably the right word there is lack of regulation with the new financial innovations. But there really was no deregulation that took place. It's just, as new types of financial products entered the world, generally they didn't really get regulated. Also, another problem with that story is last time I checked, there were over 120 regulatory agencies devoted to the financial sector in the United States. And it's one of the most heavily regulated sectors. It's like finance and pharmaceuticals. That's where a lot of the regulation is in the United States, and those two areas. So this one, I'm pretty skeptical of. Also claims the Fed did it. Poor Alan Greenspan. Right? Well, he set us off on this path, kept interest rates really low, starting in the 90s really, after the 1998 Asian financial crisis. And this spurred all the borrowing in the housing market that led to the housing boom. Also, the internet boom in the late 90s, the stock market boom in the early 2000s, about 2007. I think the Dow Jones was roughly a little over 14,000. Then it plummeted to like 6,500 during the depths of the financial crisis, and since recovered. Although recently it's sort of trending back towards that 14.5 number or so. But that's another, what economists will tend to look at. Now the political scientists, it's really about partisan politics. What is the party identity, party affiliation of the majority in the House, the Senate, and who's sitting in the White House? And the normal story is Democrats are better for the poor than Republicans. And there's a literature that tries to get at this. And when I go and estimate this, I won't show you the coefficients and all that stuff, I'll just plot out the pictures. These are all the things that I'm going to control for, that I'm going to consider as possibilities. Finally, there was a claim that what was good for Wall Street was good for Main Street, and sometimes referred to as free market fundamentalism, took over the country. Maybe that's true. I just haven't seen any data to really show it one way or the other. It's hard to find that really if you look at what's going on in terms of the actual regulations and policies that are being implemented. Maybe rhetorically that's true, but when I search it in the data, it's much, much harder to find. All right. So some people say it's really about the process. How do markets work? And that's what I'm building off of. But remember, markets don't operate in an institutional vacuum. There's property rights and contract rights. It's like the definition of free enterprise. A system of property rights and contracting rights adhering to something that looks like the rule of law. That's really like what free enterprise is about. So that's where I want to turn my attention. Because when you change the institutions, you change property law, you change contracting law, you're going to affect the distribution indirectly. And that's where I want to look, really focus things on. So the normal story, this is going to be like the heroic version of how markets work. But I think it's useful because it helps highlight what's going on. So in the beginning, there's entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs come up with ideas. People like the ideas. They buy them. And then so the market process begins. Right? What they're going to get, they'll get temporary monopoly profits in the short run. Right? Someone's got to be first to supply a new product. And that person, they get the monopoly profits. But as others see these high rates of return, they start thinking, hey, I could do that. I could make a variation of it. I might be able to provide it in a more cost-effective way. So you get new entrants into the market. Right? These other entrepreneurs discover these profit opportunities. And this is where it gets interesting. Right? This is where free enterprise gets eroded sometimes. You can say, all right, I can come up. All right, I got new competition. I got to come up with new ways, right, to deal with the new technologies. That's the gales of creative destruction. Other people are coming in and they're taking away my profit, so to speak. Right, the profit margins are falling. I've got to come up with new ways to keep consumers happy. And you end up in a world where it's innovate or perish. Right, that, like I said, is the sort of glorified version. But that's useful to think about things. Because sometimes what we can do is you go, yeah, these new upstart firms, they just know stuff I don't know. I can't seem to compete with that. Or consumer preferences are changing. And you start going back to, you might remember someone taught you once, there are two ways to make money. Right? One is through providing goods and services. One is to rig the game in your favor. And then you start saying, well, maybe I should do that. Right? This reallocation story, right? Prices are continually reallocating. That's hard work. Do you want to spend 50 years of your life trying to outcompete the other people? Or would it be nice that you could come up with a system, let's just call it like tenure, where I don't have to compete anymore? Right? Just hypothetically, imagine a system where after 6 years you get a job for life, no matter how stupid you really are. Right? Isn't that a great system? Wouldn't you all love that? Right? Someone came up with it. Try to get rid of it and see what happens. Right? You'll see all the interest come out and go, oh, this is kind of crazy, right? But that's the kind of system. It's evolved. And I don't want to deal with the competition. Right? But generally, markets should drive the profit margins down. Right? That's the whole point of what markets do. They drive rates of return down. They equalize across markets. That's how you move assets around. A high rate of return here, a low rate of return over here, they're brought into equilibrium. That's what you should be taught in your micro classes. But, and this is a great quote from the late economist Tibor Skotowski, who was out at Stanford. In time, however, we learn how to correct, suppress, overrule, or supplement the distributive functions of prices and price changes. And the better we learn to divorce income distribution from market forces, the more reluctant we became to accept economic inequalities imposed by the market. Yeah, sometimes we don't like the market outcomes for some reason. You think people get paid too much. You might say, oh, LeBron James, what is he really doing? Right? He's not really worth all that money, is he? And you get people complain about that. Or you go, CEOs are making all this money, especially the hedge fund CEOs. Right? They can buy like whole countries. You say something is wrong in the system. So we begin to try to figure out how to change the rules to get to whatever we think the preferred outcome is. And this is where the game begins. You can now start going, especially if you're an incumbent firm, you've existed for a while. You might have some connections. You know the members of Congress. Right, you've been to rallies. Maybe you've made some financial contributions over the years. Right, and that becomes a real viable option. I mean, existing firms have a number of advantages. I'm just going to highlight two of them. One is, chances are they have savings. Right, they've existed for a while. They have some stored up profits that they can use. What are they using it for? Lobbying. Also, like I already mentioned, they might know the members of Congress are relevant people. Right? They play golf together. Right? They've done these events together. Existing firms have an advantage over the incumbents. So who do you listen to? The person who gave you money and you play golf with? Or some random new firm? So you begin to see how this can happen. And in other words, what's going to happen is the market outcomes are people reject for some reason. And some of those people who are upset about it have access to political power that they can use to try to reshape the distribution. Because this is a great question. I think, how are we going to do it? We need lawyers, right? That's who really does all the business in D.C. And you ever ask yourself how lawyers make so much money? With apologies to Derek, I don't think they're terribly that bright. Right? I know plenty of them. It doesn't seem that hard in many ways. We'll talk about sort of what's going on in that market. Part of it is, the classic story, the number of lawyers used to be, not so much anymore, but used to be greatly restricted by the American Bar Association. So the stories were like, well, it doesn't really matter what you got on the bar exam. We're only taking a certain number because we don't want to flood the market with lawyers. As a result, you restrict supply, prices go up. Right? We've got data on that going back decades, right? Lawyer prices, in other words. You know, a less nefarious one, though, and to defend Derek, is, you know, it does take a long time to become a lawyer in almost every state. Right? You got to go to get an undergraduate degree, and in this day and age, that's like at least 5 years. Then you go to law school for another 3 years, right? So you're looking, you know, 7 or 8 years now of just going to school. Notice a 3-year extension on a lot of your peers. Well, to justify those 3 years, well, you need a rate of return on it. Also, if you sit in law classes, things you'll notice, it's like a specialized language. It's not that easy to follow along. Right? It's you know, the jargon, the specialization that you get with it. Also, if you look at just data on lawyers, they work more hours than you do, for most people. Right? They work more days per year than most people do in the United States. So all that would also help explain why they get paid a lot. They also live in what we might call a protected market. In other words, how many legal systems are there in the United States? More, I mean, I know there's some, you know, diamond market and stuff like that, or the diamond dealers, but more or less there's one. And if you're operating in like a monopoly type market, what's your incentive to innovate? Why did you come up with cost-effective ways? I mean, the clients come in and what do you tease and go, oh, you go to that other legal system and solve your problems. Right? It doesn't exist. Right? So that's also going to provide some perverse incentives. Also, lawyers are kind of unique. I say lawyers beget lawyers. But what I mean by that is, if you're like a competitor, you're a firm, and the other firm, you're a firm competing with another firm, and they have lawyers, well, it probably makes sense that you get one too. Right? You're increasing the demand for lawyers. Right? Similarly, I'll just mention the last one there. Right? They're called what we call credence goods. Isn't it great if you're a lawyer? Someone comes into your office, and you're the supplier of the product, and you tell them how much to buy. That's what a credence good is. Right? Where you're both the supplier and telling them how much to purchase of your product. It's like going to see a medical doctor. You don't really know what's going on. Right? They just tell you to take these tests. Do you fight them? Maybe sometimes. You went to WebMD and you're convinced you have cancer. Maybe you say, no, I need more tests. Kind of thing. But generally, it's kind of weird. Right? The mechanisms to discipline cost increases are not really in the market for lawyers. Right? Just to give you some ideas, this is the latest data I could find, 2012. For an equity partner, it's $355 an hour. The junior partner there, that's what the second one should be. That shouldn't be the same. The junior equity partner, or the junior partner, $232. And meanwhile, your average American is making $24 an hour. Obviously, what's going to happen is, you know, here's one study from '94. A lot of middle-income Americans do not get lawyers. And I've got some more recent evidence now too on this. They just can't afford to have a lawyer. Right? Now, only the rich can afford to have the lawyers. Where you see your average American getting legal advice, it's on very standardized products. Wills, bankruptcy, uncontested divorces. Think LegalZoom. Right? How has that firm succeeded? Well, they're dealing where, you know, it's relatively standardized contracts you're going to write. Right? It's not the more complicated things that arise in the world. So I ask again, who hires lawyers? Well, it's the rich. That's right. The rich have lawyers. If you get nothing else tonight, the bottom line is the rich have lawyers, the rest of us have LegalZoom. Right? And that's going to create a distortion in the system. Probably get sued by LegalZoom now. Right? What do lawyers do? Why could they be harmful? They can mainly reduce productivity increases for innovation and invention. Think of the Kelo decision. It's a little more than 10 years old now. That was a takings case up in Connecticut. And afterwards, there was a large number of changes in the United States, suggesting the undermining of property rights. Well, if your property rights aren't as secure, you're less likely to make investments. If you're less likely to invest in things, well, that means your income is going to grow at lower rates. Right? Think of patents, or sometimes referred to as patent trolls. I got my little MacBook here. Right? Didn't they patent the curvature on it? Did you know that? Right? They devoted real resources so they could get money from this kind of stuff. Right? What they're trying to do, this is more broadly about intellectual property rights. People buy up intellectual property rights for no other reason than to not use them, to stifle more innovation. Right? They buy up the patents and they sit on them. They do nothing with them because they don't want some upstart firm taking that idea and then out-competing them. One of the lesser-known stories is if you look at international trade treaties, who do you think's at the table when we're negotiating things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that's been in the news recently? It's not economists drawing their supply and demand pictures showing deadweight losses. That's not who's there. Right? There might be one in the room just for fun. But really, it's lawyers there making the case why their firm needs some sort of protection from international competition. If you ever go read these treaties, go to, what is it, thomas.gov, you would think like a free trade treaty would be about 5 words long, right? Instead, they're hundreds and hundreds of pages long. It's like, we believe in free trade except 8,000 exceptions to it for various industries. Right? How did they get there? Right? These were their lawyers representing them. The consumer, who's representing them in the trade negotiations? The people who actually buy the products. Right? We get whatever gets shipped here, but it might not be really what we want. Similarly, we have the famous ambulance chasers and their effects on insurance markets. Right, raising them. One of the things that, for a lot of people, you've heard stories probably about how like a serious medical condition or something like that, an unanticipated one, is like the #1 source of bankruptcies in the United States. Well, how did we get into this situation where it became so costly? Now, there's a lot of factors, but one is simply insurance costs. Went up because if you're a doctor or something, right, how much insurance do you have to buy to protect yourself from lawsuits? I have a friend in New Jersey. He's a medical doctor. He told me 1/3 of his income is devoted just to his insurance to protect him, kind of thing. I mean, that's a lot of resources devoted to what? Couldn't they be devoted to something else? Now, of course, right, I'll just mention these quickly. Some lawyers are helpful. Okay, yes, some do protect. There's like 1% of lawyers who do pro bono work. There's like 5% of lawyers who actually do what you think lawyers do, fight the man, and are protecting the rights of the disenfranchised, but it's a really small number. Overwhelmingly, people who go to law school go to work for corporations. That's who they work for, okay? It's not like you see on TV, fighting this local level injustice, right? Those people at the local level don't have any money, right? So they don't get justice, so to speak. Tax havens. You might say, depending on your view on that, some people say they're very helpful, right? It's a disciplinary device. Although I mentioned Zuckman's recent book, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, it's called The Scourge of Tax Havens, to give you a flavor for what the argument's going to be in that book. He's obviously against it, but it's worth looking at, I think, to see, and his argument is it costs a lot of federal tax revenue with all the stuff that's hiding in Switzerland and stuff like that. All right. Like I said, my real issue is what's the net effect of all this? So here's really the whole point of this talk. It's just a correlation between the lawyers per capita, and I adjusted the Gini, so I didn't make that mistake. The correlation is like 0.98. And all those things I mentioned before, the real value of the minimum wage, union density, partisan politics type variables, I controlled for all of that. It withstands all of it. Right, so that's one way to look at it. Like they practically move together over time. Here's the ratio of the income of the top 5% to the median. The correlation is about 0.95. Same controls, same outcomes. Interestingly, all those other variables except one, which I'll get to, don't matter. They don't show any systematic relationship. It's this lawyers per capita variable that does. Another picture, the income share of the top 10%, correlation is about 0.95, same story. They track each other. I lag these things, they're not contemporaneous, if you care about that. And so these are the lag number of lawyers so last year's number of lawyers, for example, on this year's inequality, that's what I'm capturing here. And this effect seems to withstand no matter what I try to do. I also looked at the ratio of the bottom quintile to the median. Because if my claim is right, I shouldn't see any relationship between what's going on with income inequality in the bottom half of the distribution. Right? That's what I'm really looking at here. That number is remarkably constant over time. It's roughly, the bottom 20% income is about 40% of the median in the United States. Bounces around a little, but it's more or less about 42%, something like that. Over the, from 1960 to up to 2010. There is nothing there. This lawyer story does not apply to what's happening down there. It's really just about the income of the top to wherever you want to cut the distribution. So all those things that people talk about, I don't find it in the data. Right? They're actually there if I don't control for lawyers. It's the inclusion of the lawyer variable that wipes them all out, except for one that I should mention. It's the political affiliation of the president. And it has so-called the wrong sign. Right? If there's a Democrat president in office, income inequality is rising, controlling for the other factors. Probably my best guess on what's going on there right now is simply Democrat presidents tend to get elected during recessions in the post-war period. Right? I think Obama's probably the most vivid example of that. Right? Bill Clinton was the same thing. Carter, it wasn't all rainbows and unicorns back then either. Right? And so what you're getting is you're getting convergence, mean reversion. Right? The economy's going to grow faster because it's below trend. Well, when the economy tends to grow fast, you also get rising inequality, kind of thing. So I have tried everything, and if you have any suggestions how to wipe out that variable, I'd love to hear them, because I know that's going to be a problem in terms of publication. Although it's like the dirty little secret in the literature. It's all on the tables and the papers, and nobody comments. Beautiful, really. But it seems to be something out there we're trying to figure out. All right, so last thing. The recession, if you believe what I've been saying about lawyers driving a lot of inequality by deterring innovation and invention, maybe the Great Recession wasn't all bad. Because since then, you have seen an enormous drop in law school applications. And this is like heretical, but in some law schools, tuition has fallen. How does that happen in the 21st century, right? Also, we've learned that we can outsource a lot of lawyer activity. Right? Outsourcing is beginning to it started off in like manufacturing, the stories you've heard. It is moving through the economy. Lawyers, the accountants are right up next, it seems. The NPR did a nice story over the summer predicting the probability, like you'd have a job in 20 years, or would your profession exist? It doesn't look good for accountants. Because, with the rise of TurboTax, increasingly people are moving away from accountants, kind of thing. Now, what will be interesting and where this research is headed is, if the accounting groups will ever cooperate with me, to see what role they've had in changing the accounting rules in favor of the rich in terms of tax breaks and things like that. All right, so that's where I think I'll stop. Thank you for coming out.